tonight is a joint session of the seminar Boundaries of History of the Faculty of History and Center for Historical Research, High School of Economics in Saint Petersburg, and the Laboratory for Comparative and Social Research, also Higher School of Economics in Moscow and Saint Petersburg, and Eduard Panarin, the head of the laboratory professor of sociology, is here with us. I was about to make a joke. Three of us were, and I'm sure many more people have been to the University of Michigan, and the University of Michigan rule is we start 10 after. So it's really strange to start sharp, 6 sharp. Anyhow, next time we'll try to replicate. So this is a joint session of the two seminars, and this event is made possible by the support of the Network of Empire Nationalism Studies and the associated portal Net.abimperio.net of the Ab Imperio network. This is another installment in the series of public events organized by the portal and the network that brings critical historical expertise to the public debate and for the benefit of society. And there's a lot of machinery in here, and I would like to explain to you what is going to happen. This event is being broadcasted, we're linked, better to say, by Polycom with our audience, High School of Economics Moscow campus. So there is an audience there, welcome. And there is a broadcasting through the portal Net.abimperio.net that goes all over the world, that goes globally. And the synchronous Russian translation is provided for this lecture and the discussion section. This event is also being taped by the portal and will be available at net.abimperio.net with the Russian translation of both the public lecture and the discussion. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you our speaker tonight, Ronald Suny of the University of Michigan, who comes to us from, shall I say, near of road, from the American Academy in Berlin. And the topic of his public lecture is Legacies of Empire in Russian History. It is hard to imagine a more ideal speaker for the seminar series Boundaries of History. In this seminar, we take boundaries literally and metaphorically. We explore the interdisciplinary connections between historical thinking, historical research, and other social sciences and humanities. And we also seek to ascertain the research agenda of the comparative global and transnational history, wherein the transcendence of the boundaries of the national history is the key for the opening of a new research agenda and new understanding of the past. Ronald Suny is Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. In his career, he strove to put political science and history into dialogue and always insisted that historians should work with analytical models and ideal types, Weberian ideal types, which is more characteristic of the research and logic of social sciences. In the historical part of his academic career, Ronald Suny made a single contribution to the field of Soviet history by putting the Soviet nationality policy, nationalism, and the composite space of the Soviet Union into the center stage of the writing on Soviet history. It is thanks to his contribution that we no longer think of national history as a natural, and therefore a historical form of the past experience of the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. And it is thanks to his work that we now understand the logic of the development struggle and negotiation of the polity and society that was always characterized and continues to be characterized by multi-ethnicity and diversity of languages and culture. I would like to mention a few books. The Baku Commune, 1917 through 1908, Princeton University Press, published 1972. More recently, The Revenge of the Past, Stanford University Press, 93, and a path-setting volume for new writing on Soviet history, A State of Nations, Empire Nation-Making in the Age of Lenin and Stalin, with Oxford University Press, 2001. In the middle, you have a series of writings, The Making of Georgian Nation, Looking Toward Ararat, Armenian Modern History, and the book The Soviet Experiment, in the sense that it didn't go terribly wrong, or perhaps it did. Oxford University Press, 1998. It is also interesting that as a historian, Ronald Suny positioned himself in the field of theoretical thinking about nationalism, with theorizing the notion of national identity and national history, and nationalism as both emancipatory and mobilizatory force in the field of politics and society. Ronald Suny received the Distinguished Contribution Award from the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, formerly AAASS, in 2013, and continues to work on many of his projects, most notably the book project on the Armenian genocide in the comparative context of imperial collapse and the First World War, as well as the book project co-authored with Val Kivelson of the University of Michigan, which is focused on rethinking historical experience and pathways of empire in Russian history. I also wanted to note that Ronald Suny has been a helping hand in bringing historians from different national traditions together for a scholarly dialogue and innovative thinking about the past. One is the dialogue between the Turkish and Armenian historians, and also his efforts need to be mentioned here of bringing historians from the post-Soviet space, North America, Europe together for thinking about new research questions. And Ron Suny, of course, serves as a member of editorial board of Ab Imperio project, and I'm very proud of this association. So tonight we have a public lecture and an Q&A session. The public lecture will be in English. The Q&A may be both in English and in Russian. We'll take questions both in English and in Russian. And I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Ronald Suny to Petersburg and Higher School of Economics in Saint Petersburg.
Спасибо большое, Саша. Он не говорит по-русски, я говорю по-русски. Свободно, но неграмотно. Поэтому, извините, я буду выступать по-английски. Но я могу отвечать на вопрос по-русски или как вы хотите. Хорошо? Окей, договорились. Вы уже видели вот пиджак, да? Я снимаю. Я профессор, мне не нужен пиджак. Okay. What I'm going to talk about tonight, is a project that a wonderful colleague of mine at the University of Michigan, Valerie Kivelson, historian of early Russia, and I are preparing now for Oxford University Press. And the book is called Russia's Empires. And we're trying in a way to look afresh at the whole history of Russia, all the way back from Kiev and Rus to the present, through indeed up to whatever's going on in Crimea and Ukraine today, to try to see if we can understand this history through the lens of empire. And so I want to mention first of all that both in the West and sometimes in Russia itself, normal historical development has been looked at whenever people turn their attention to Russia in what I would call a generally liberal vision. That is, a vision that prioritized individualism, economic rationality, capitalism, constitutionalism, and the form of the nation. Now, if that liberal vision, so powerful in the West, and indeed in Russia as well, for some time after the collapse of the Soviet Union, if one adopts that vision and sees it as the normal way of human development, that is the path of civilization, as it was called during the Yeltsin era, then by default, most of Russia's past is seen as backward, an outlier, off the track of the general evolution of civilization. So Russia is characterized very often in the West as a peculiar society, with its people, by the way, inherently slavish and submissive. You think I'm exaggerating, right? And its preferred governmental system being at least authoritarian if not autocratic or dictatorial. Russia, in other words, is the mirror, the opposite dark mirror image of the West. And by understanding Russia so negatively, the West understands itself as positive, progressive, democratic, free, etc. Emphasis both in popular and scholarly accounts place the emphasis in Russian history on lawlessness rather than the rule of law, the collective rather than the individual, the strong state rather than a gelatinous society, while all such macro-historical simplifications, of course, contain some truth, and but in fact, what Val and I are objecting to is the insistence on the permanence, the persistence, the fatalism of this view of Russian history, or any idea of a Russian national character that must emerge repeatedly no matter what people try to do with their country. We are interested more in the diverse and divergent patterns and the particularities of this longue durée, the long history that Russia has gone through. So we are not going to look for the roots of a Russian nation, leave that aside, and we are not going to dig for the origins of the revolution. Much of imperial history was always seen as leading inevitably to the revolution, so never appreciating the imperial differences in their own terms. And we're not looking at the Soviet Union simply from 1991 back as a failed experiment that had to eventually collapse. What we are going to do instead, we hope, is highlight one fundamental defining characteristic of Russia's forms of government that we believe has endured powerfully throughout its history, and that is its imperial form of rule, which we are going to define, and I'll be more specific in a moment, through difference, and in most of its history, through inequality. From the first glimmers in the Kievan period, through the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian power, we believe, in its various different iterations, different existences, was built on relations of difference, whether it was of tribe or language or faith or region or estate, soslovia, or rank or class or dynasty, not to mention gender, in more concealed and naturalized ways. Through most of its history, or their history, Russian rulers and those they ruled understood power relations as particularized, manifested in different modes, not homogeneous, allowing different claims and different obligations according to these hierarchies of difference. Let me talk a bit about what we understand as empire, imperia. Empire was a polity, a political form, based first on conquest, завоевание, and maintained through the difference between the ruling institution and its subjects, as well as a subordination of the periphery to the center. War and violence both made the Russian Empire and brought the imperial Russian form to an end, only to be replaced by a new state formation, the Soviet Union, itself the product of economic and military collapse and revolutionary violence. As central as war was, both to the expanding of the Tsar's realm and the sway of the USSR over other states, Russia, we believe, was usually a reluctant warrior, and its expansion across two continents was often a defensive response to feared enemies than an ambition to expand. I think Putin would like this talk so far. Anyway, we'll see. When one considers square acreage and continuity over time, the Russian Empire was the largest land empire and the most durable, that is, the most long-lived in all of human history. Its very size, its vastness, presented immense problems for governance, communication, and made it difficult for the formation of a sense of shared history and fate. In other words, made a single, coherent national identity very difficult to achieve. Like the largest boy on the block, or the bully in the playground, Russia made its neighbors nervous, and still makes them nervous. Except for Armenians, we like it because we have the Turks next door, so we have to, Azerbaijanis, Turks, and we don't trust the Georgians that much either. Okay, so, but like the biggest boy on the playground, Russia made its our neighbors nervous, and is perceived historically and at the present time, and this is a reality that Russia must realize, is perceived to be a threat to others. Now, it turns out Russia in the world is relatively weak. Russian government spends 7% of what the United States spends on defense. But it is strong compared to its neighbors, Georgia, Ukraine, etc. So it's a very peculiar position that it's in. Paradoxically, this huge state was uniquely vulnerable through its history. Vulnerable to nomads in Central Asia, Crimea and Turkestan, and eventually from modern militarized powers in the West. I would argue Russia was neither eternally aggressive and expansionist, but also, nor was it capable of completely defeating or keeping out threats from many of its neighbors. Imagine the countries Russia was most afraid of and placed the greatest danger on Russia in the 17th and 18th century were such terrible enemies as Poland and Sweden, the Tatars, the Ottomans, and the Habsburg empires. If the United States in the 21st century is called a security state, I would argue that Russia and the Soviet Union, through much of its history, can be considered an insecurity state. Now, what's the big question of this book? As young social scientists, and everybody in this room is younger than me, I think. I'm much older than you think. So I was first in the Soviet Union in 1964. I was here when Khrushchev fell from power, so think about that. Anyway, throughout this book, what question are we asking? And every young social scientist and every social scientist must have some puzzle, some question that they're asking. We're interested in the question, how did this enterprise stay together? What keeps this vast state, or kept this vast state, together? How did the rulers of Russia and the Soviet Union maintain an essential degree of cohesion? Now, for this answer, one could take the answer that would immediately come to mind in the West. That is violence, force, насилие. They would, that would be the answer, terror. But we are looking to other things. Of course, states are often based, and many states underneath are based on violence and force. But no state lasts very long based simply on force, on violence. That's the first lesson of political science, is that states are not built just on power. They look for authority. They look for legitimacy of some kind. How do the Russians achieve this? It's very interesting. That is, there are emotional ties to the state and to people within the country. There are claims of reciprocity. I will talk more about reciprocity. Do you have a Russian word for reciprocity? Взаимность. That's a very key concept that we are trying to develop in this book. There were these взаимные отношения between the rulers and the people they ruled, and within the ruling elites themselves. Though empires often then come to power and are built through war, violence, conquest, they only last for long times when discursive power is added to coercive power. You need some kind of hegemonic culture or understanding to keep these states together. Coercion itself exclusively was never enough to keep and rule the empire. So we are also fighting against a very prominent and prevalent notion, an image of Russia in the West, that Russia was always, or at most times, despotic and tyrannical. It was a despotism and a tyranny. And we're arguing instead that it was a much more complex thing, except for certain periods. We're not saying there was much reciprocity in the time of Oprichnina, or even in the time of Peter the Great, but at other times, even in the 1930s, even during Stalinism, there were these notions of reciprocity. So over time, Russian and Soviet governments fought hard and sought to gain legitimacy and authority as they convinced subordinated populations that the rulers that were ruling them had the right to rule them, and you shouldn't protest too much against that. And that those who were being ruled, those below, would gain some benefits from the reciprocal relationship with their imperial overlords. The people ruled had to feel that they too benefited from the inequitable, occasionally repressive imperial arrangement in which they lived. One of the strategies for ruling this diverse empire was collaboration with non-Russian elites. But that was only one of many multiple strategies used by the imperial power to forge loyalty from its subjects. Perception and often acceptance of inequitable treatment is an important part of the imperial relationship. I would argue empire exists even when the subordinate and peripheral populations are convinced that the result of their association with empire is beneficial rather than exploitative, as long as they maintain distinction and subordination. Even if you're colonialized, and even if that colonization is imposed externally, nevertheless, and is maintained by a sense that those who are ruling over you are superior and you are inferior, and nevertheless, even if you think you're doing pretty well in this enterprise, we can still call this enterprise an empire. We begin in our story with Kievan Rus, which we are not saying is imperial. Rather, Kievan Rus is a political arrangement which doesn't have very firm notions of statehood, of a territorialized area in which a single government rules. And we're using a notion, I won't talk a lot about this today, but we're using a notion of Kievan Rus as a kind of solar system, as a galactic system, in which there are different centers of power, and occasionally one will rise up as a sun and others gravitate around them. But it's almost pre-state, and certainly pre-imperial. We are going to argue in this book, something that will sound familiar, I think, to most of you, that it's in Muscovy, beginning with the sacralization of rule under Ivan IV, Ivan Grozny, that the czars will begin to, that the Grand Dukes, first of all, will call themselves czar, and will begin to build what we can call an empire. After that, the rulers of the Russian states played up their responsiveness to popular desires for order and justice. For a stern and merciful paternal ruler, ordinary people knew that they were not equal to those ruling over them, and yet at the same time they expected that those people had a job to do, to keep order and to provide justice. By the time of troubles, by the twentieth времени, this language of reciprocity had been adopted by the people, ordinary people, as a mode of navigating the collective inequities of imperial rule. Inflated with this novel notion of reciprocity, popular movements continue to express an idea of the state, of the polity, as a stratified, differentiated set of collectives in which claims were based on membership in particular groups. Let me just explain. In other words, if in modern democratic states we all expect to have generally, ideally, equal rights and equal obligations, in earlier forms of government, particularly in Russia, but also in Europe and Asia and elsewhere, people did not have that expectation. They understood that their social position gave them certain obligations and certain rights, but different ones from other people in other social locations, certain other social groupings. In other words, there was always a profound sense of difference, of particularism, and stratification. And this resonated and harmonized with what we're calling an imperial form of rule. In other words, we are thinking of Russian governance for much of its history, and even today, you'll excuse me for that, as characterized by what has been called authoritarianism with the consent of the governed. Sounds like a contradiction. Authoritarianism with the consent of the governed. In the 18th century, Peter the Great was so anxious to build the city and change his country that he largely pushed aside this notion of reciprocity. So for that period of Peter's rule, other forms are used to control, motivate, and rule the empire. But after Peter, this reciprocity, imagined by 17th century Muscovites, assumes a new, sentimental guise among the court elites, while notions of the natural condition of difference and differential rights, privileges, and obligations continued to hold sway. If you look at the late 18th century, in an important and ultimately risky move, this emotional idea, this affective idea of reciprocity that was supposed to link elites and the Matushka ruler, Catherine the Great, was extended downward as well, resulting in what I would say is a very sugary or sweet vision of love and obligation binding elites to their serfs. Now, such a move of romanticizing that relationship with the people and with ordinary peasants, and the sentimentalism that you already find in Biedna Eliza and elsewhere in Karamzin's story, this move actually has within it very dangerous fruits, because coming up in the end of the 18th century and with the French Revolution and in the early 19th century, a moment I call the moment of the nation, new ideas were coming from the West of this new kind of political formation called the nation, and eventually the nation state. So this sweet, sugary vision of affective, emotional bonds between masters and serfs will be turned by some into a new sense of obligation, a new kind of reciprocity that required not only merciful condescension, but actually liberation, освобождение, that is, freeing of the serfs. So this becomes very complicated. The promises you make can be realized in various different ways. In this period of the early 19th century, the age-old sense of rule through natural hierarchy was challenged by a national sense of equality and sameness. New forms of claim-making based in growing notions of popular sovereignty, rule by the people, intensified these new understandings of reciprocity. Russians and non-Russians alike began to contest fiercely rival notions of what kind of state Russia should be. And this became a huge debate within the intelligentsia as it begins to emerge in the 1830s and the 1840s and on. It's interesting that the Russian intelligentsia doesn't particularly use often the Western word natsiya, but it uses the word narod in a variety of different and related meanings. How this imperial form, how empires would manage to survive for another 200 years when the nation state was already appearing in Western Europe is an extraordinarily interesting question. There would be attempts in Russia's imperial setting under Nicholas I to somehow marry the notion of empire together with nationalism. That is, this so-called official nationality, right? Pravoslavia, and narodnost. So that's an attempt to bring these contradictory things together, at least for a while. When Russian rulers and intellectuals looked to the West and saw how powerful this new discourse of the nation and nationalism were in mobilizing ordinary people to fight against whomever, enemies, Napoleon, whatever, they too hoped to be able to use some of these new inspirations. Intellectual elites debated how to reach the people, how they might teach them or learn from them. And these mobilizing ideas that stimulated people to think about the good of Russia, how to save Russia in one way or another. Interestingly enough, it was not particularly nationalist ideas that ultimately mobilized people, particularly in this city, to eventually overthrow the state in 1917. But other ideas of community based on class solidarity were much more important in the initial phases of the February and October revolutions. So that as you move into the Soviet period, new concepts of difference, that is, who was to be in the Soviet socialist community and who was supposed to be outside. Who were these chuzhiye люди? Who were these people who didn't function or were superfluous now, lishnie люди, in the Soviet period? Again, very careful distinctions were made. Not as you would do in a nation state homogenizing people, but distinguishing those as loyal, disloyal, people of the past, proletarians, etc. So that idea of differentiation and hierarchy remained, and the same kind of imperial ideology that somehow if you let us rule over you, we will bring you to civilization. The British in India would say, we come from the West, we have white skin, we're the ones who can tell you how to reach civilization. We'll build railroads for you, we'll give you bureaucracy, we'll build courts, and so forth. And in the Soviet period, you had this Communist Party saying, let us rule you, and we'll bring you into the greatest future of all, we'll bring you into socialism. Right? The problem with this view of a civilizational motivation for empire, which was also in the imperial empire and in the Soviet empire, the problem is what I call the dialectic of empire, or the dilemma of empire. What if, in fact, the elite actually achieves what it says it's going to do? Then what justification does it have to rule? Let's say the British in India actually educate a bunch of Indians, like Gandhi and Nehru and others. Who needs the British to rule India? Why can't Indians do it themselves? What if the Communist Party of Lenin and Stalin actually turns a country that's 80% peasant into a country that's 80% urban, industrial, and one of the most literate societies in the world? Who needs those Communist Party, those aging, decrepit Brezhnevs to rule over these people who are now able to rule themselves? So you can see that an empire can be too successful and ultimately lead to its own demise. I call that the dialectic or dilemma of democracy.
Empire.
Again, not democracy has its own dilemmas. Yeah, you're right, of empire. I would even argue that in the time of Stalin, in the depths of the terror, many people in that empire understood that they also stood in a relationship of reciprocity, loyalty, obediency in the Soviet context. If you were loyal, if you were obedient, if you were a good communist or a good Sovietsky человек, if you worked hard, you would be and you could expect to be rewarded with favors, with anticipated material well-being, and with lifelong security. And if you weren't, you would be punished severely. So there was even a kind of reciprocity. For all the faults of the Soviet regime had a very strong idea of the public or common good, something that we have lost in many countries today. I could speak of my own country as well. The end of the Soviet Union at first replaced a regime based on officially proclaimed notions of the common good, of social equality, and shared obligations with a capitalist system of individual enterprise and differentiated rewards. The social safety net that had been one of the most cohesive elements of the Soviet system, that the Soviets had incompletely erected, was suddenly shredded and disappeared. A free-for-all economy led to general impoverishment, highlighted by the visibility of obscenely rich oligarchs favored by the government. Yet, I would maintain, and you know this better than I, and you can certainly correct me, in popular attitudes, in people's personal moralities, and even in state policies, the idea of reciprocal obligations of the state to its people remained. Society in post-Soviet Russia and in post-Soviet Armenia, even more I can tell you, expected aid from the state. And ultimately the state renewed some of the protections that had been embedded in Russian and Soviet political practices of the past. Entering the 21st century, the Russian state, as well as other former Soviet states, looks more and more like a nation state than at almost any other time in its history. Empire, as a political form, seemed historically moribund. It seemed likely to die away. But remember one thing I said at the beginning. The image of Russia as an empire, which is conceived in the words of their own government, in the language of Velikia Держава, maintains and remains a phantom in the imagination, both of Russian politicians and many in neighboring states wary of the gigantic state next door. Whether the Russian Federation is today a nation state, or a multinational state, or an empire, is a question, the answer to which we will try to find in the stories that of the regimes that have preceded the current Russian regime. Let me turn now to talk briefly about empire as a historical category. you almost cannot avoid talking about empire if you're doing Russian history. And yet, it has been used casually, informally, without much analysis, without serious engagement into what this concept might mean. It's simply used descriptively rather than analytically. So I want to propose a way we might understand empire and what we might understand as imperialism and imperial rule. The first thing to note is that empire is an extraordinarily long-lived, durable form of government running back to the ancient Middle East, to Sumeria, to Assyria, to Babylonia, to Egypt, all the way up to the present. It usually has referred to large states, though small states might also be thought of as empires. It usually refers to a single sovereign power, an autocrat perhaps. And it also usually refers to a country of diversity, of difference. Right? And these are the three meanings that have survived into modern times, from ancient empires, from Rome to the present. Supreme power of the ruler, a vast big domain, and diversity of lands and peoples. Emperors are more than kings. A king rules a single land or a single people, even if its population is really diverse. Emperors rule over many people and lands, often over many princes and kings as well. While for many, the model of empire, in the minds of many, was the Roman Empire, for Russia, the models were different. They were the Eastern Roman Empire, to be sure, Byzantium, and also the vast Mongol Empire, established first by Genghis Khan. Attached to the idea of empire, these empires, and even the Russian Empire, were notions of universalism, expansion, and for a long time, indefinite frontiers. Not so firm borders, but indefinite frontiers. And very often, a notion of a single, exclusive world domain. Now, Russia was a vast, contiguous, continental empire. Not like Britain, the Netherlands, France, or Portugal, overseas empires. Some have even considered the United States as a continental empire state. But we always describe ourselves positively in our history. That is, in Jefferson's term, Thomas Jefferson's term, we were an empire of freedom. Now remember, Jefferson was a slave owner too, right? So there's always a kind of, I always tell my students, during the Cold War, we called ourselves the free world. And the free world included not only Britain and France, but South Africa, much of the Middle East, and even the state of Mississippi. So, it was not as free as they said. So, what's my definition of empire? Historians actually don't like to start with definitions because that's a political sciencey kind of trick, or sociologists. But it seems to me we ought to be clear about what we're talking about. And the definition should obviously come out of historical evidence, empirical study, etc. But eventually you settle down and say, I'm going to call this empire, I'm going to call this revolution, I'm going to call this genocide, so that we can at least talk about what we're talking about and maybe do some comparative historical or sociological work. As we understand them, empires are mixed or composite state formations, characterized by two main things: institutionalized difference between the ruler and those ruled. So the British in India would be a good one, or the Tsar and his aristocracy over the rest of the people, or the Communist Party and the nomenclatura over the rest of the people. Clear difference between ruler and ruled. And secondly, besides difference, inequality. Some are better than others. Some are superior to others. And because they're superior, they have the right to rule over the inferior. That's their form of legitimation. And when that becomes shaky, people will look to things like race, something hard and biological, to justify the difference between those who have the right to rule and those who are to be ruled. This idea of empire is an ideal type in the Weberian sense, as Sasha mentioned. It's a kind of state or a particular form of domination or control. But it is based on difference, superiority, the superiority based in difference. Therefore, if one accepted that as a working definition, you can already see that empire is very different from the ideal type of a nation state. A nation state is not about inequitable rule over something different. A nation state, at least in theory, if not in practice, is about the rule of the same people over a similar people, the same people. That is, nation states are about homogeneity, not difference, and about equality, not superiority and inferiority. People in nation states, ideally, are citizens, not subjects of the ruling elite. In empire, unlike nations, the difference and distance between the rulers and the ruled is part of the ideological justification for the subordination of those being ruled. So it's not accidental that in most empires, the emperor might be of a different nationality. Most of the czars of Russia were some Germans, or something like that, right? Most of the kings of Europe were German rather than of the nation they were ruling. That distance was important. That difference was important. In nation states, the people you choose to rule over you, or that rule over you, should be basically of your own community. So, when we turn to Russian history then, the argument is that we believe empire begins in Russian history largely with Moscow in the 16th century. About 1547, if you want an exact date, I think it was a Thursday afternoon, I'm not sure, when Ivan decided he was Tsar, that is Caesar. He was the emperor of Russia. Much earlier, the Russian lands had been a network of peoples, princes, and lands, and these Muscovite princes did establish what you might call a territorialization of rulership over a given territory. So we have now what we can call states, and we have now what we can call eventually an empire. We don't have necessarily a nation or a nation state. Now, let me distinguish one more thing. I know this is too many definitions at once, but one more kind of definition, and that is the difference between nation and nation state. You can't have a nation state unless you have a nation. But what is a nation? And here I'm following much of the work that's been done by Western thinkers on nationalism, particularly Benedict Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, Ernst Gellner, people like that. A nation is not a political structure like an empire or a nation state or a multinational state. A nation is a community of people. It's a group of people who have shared understandings of who they are and what they want. A nation is a group of people who believe or imagine that because they share certain characteristics, could be language, could be religion, could be race, could be history, experience, good or bad, because they share these things, they ought to have the right to rule themselves. So nation is a peculiar form of political understanding in which culture gives you the right to politics. It's based on some shared culture, political or ethnic, which gives you the right to rule yourself. this clear notion that people of a similar culture have the right to rule themselves, and that the people ought to be the source, ultimately, of government, is a relatively modern notion. Largely with the late 18th century, particularly in the French Revolution, and comes to a kind of intellectual fruition in the age of Romanticism, in the early 19th century, in what I've called the moment of the nation. It isn't that there are not some kinds of shared understandings or communities, religious, ethnic, linguistic, tribal, whatever, before. There are. And some of them call themselves Nazio or Nazia or something like that. But it's only when there is a discourse of the nation, only when there is a widespread understanding that because you have this shared culture, you have the right to rule yourself. That is a relatively modern notion that comes late 18th century and becomes powerful in the 19th and 20th century. And as a result of that discourse of the nation, empires are in trouble. Because now there is an alternative form based on this popular notion of the people as a nation that can undermine and threaten empires. So from the middle of the 19th century, empires are desperately trying to find ways to survive, to modernize themselves, even to nationalize themselves so that they can compete in the world increasingly dominated by nation states. Right? And Russia too tries that in a variety of ways. I mentioned one, Nicholas I's idea of official nationality. Later there would be Alexander III's attempt to Russify large parts of the country, or bureaucratize and make laws more homogeneous. There are a number of different attempts in Russia. In the Austrian Empire, there was an idea of differentiating people and giving certain rights and privileges to the Hungarians and to the Czechs, etc., different ways, to Germans and so forth. In the Ottoman Empire, they had a millet system. They had an idea at a certain point of an Ottomanist solution in which everyone would become an equal citizen of the Ottoman Empire. This was a dismal failure once you get to Sultan Abdul Hamid II after 1878. And eventually their solution to modernization was the most drastic of all, the physical elimination of large numbers of their own subjects, namely in the genocide of the Armenians in 1915. Did you really think you'd get through this lecture without hearing about Armenians? No. I'm going to talk now about one episode which is often talked about as the moment of a nation in Russian history. But of course, I'm going to be arguing a little differently than that. And that is the early 20th century, the struggle of the Russian people and the Tsar against Napoleon. Because very often, this is used as a historical example of a coherent, conscious, mobilized Russian nation. First of all, one can say that to the reigning monarchs of Europe, Napoleon's imperial ambitions were an intolerable threat. In 1805, Russia joined Britain, Sweden, and Austria in the Third Coalition against France. But in a series of colossal battles, Austerlitz, Jena, and Auerstadt, Napoleon once again overwhelmed his enemies and forced Russia to accept the humiliating peace of Tilsit in 1807, the price of which was the de facto alliance with France and opposition to Britain. Maybe you don't know this, but Alexander's mother, the emperor's mother, was very upset with her son for accepting that treaty with France, and he had to explain to her that he was playing for time, and I quote from the emperor, to breathe freely and to increase in the course of this most precious time the resources of strength of Russia, unquote. And indeed, Alexander I used that time well. Technically, he was an ally of Napoleon. He used that connection in a brief war with Sweden that resulted in the annexation of Finland. In 1808, he sent his troops into Finland, which had for 600 years been part of the Kingdom of Sweden. As he put it in his gracious manifesto, in accordance, I'm quoting again from Alexander, in accordance with the will of the Almighty, who has blessed our arms, we have united the province of Finland to the Russian Empire for all time, unquote. It's very interesting that in Alexander's policies in Finland, because he was afraid of Finnish loyalties to their old master Sweden, the Russian state helped generate Finnish nationalism. That is, they supported the so-called Fennomanics and others who proposed a Finnish nationality that up to this point had been hardly consciously understood. In determining conditions in Finland, wrote the emperor to his governor general, my intention has been to give the peoples of that country a political existence so they would not consider themselves conquered by Russia, but joined to it by their own self-evident interests. That's a very, unquote, that's a very enlightened imperial policy. He's looking for legitimacy. He's not going to hold those Finns for the next 100 years by force, but trying to generate their own interest in staying within Russia. Well, Alexander had more important things to do. It proved that he was quite an independent partner of France. When Napoleon fought the Austrians, Alexander decided not to participate, but hold his troops back. He thwarted the French plan to keep all English goods out of Europe, and thus compelled the British to come to terms with France. Alexander broke the continental blockade that Napoleon wanted in 1810. Napoleon was furious, and both emperors steadily built up their forces for the coming clash, which happened, as you know, because you've read the book, right, War and Peace, in 1812. Now, what's interesting in this particular episode is that the emperor depended on his defense of Russia largely on a number of high aristocratic officers, many of whom were, of course, not ethnically Russian, Bagration being Georgian, Barclay de Tolly having Scottish or something like that. Originally, by this time, they're all really Russian in culture, but still. And eventually on Kutuzov, of course, who was Russian. Russia won this catastrophic war with France for a number of reasons. Thanks to its strategy of retreat, to the generalship of Kutuzov, to the determination of the emperor not to give in, and to the logistical difficulties faced by France in their attempt to defeat a resistant Russia. Napoleon was unable to equip and feed his gargantuan army, while the Russians managed not only to supply their army, but to cripple the French by killing almost all of their horses. The horse, as Dominic Lieven tells us in his book on the battles, was perhaps the most single decisive factor in Russia's defeat of Napoleon. Well, where are the Russian people in these narratives? Where is the nation? Russian patriotic writers and historians, so we've got horses, we've got winter, we've got the emperor, we've got Kutuzov, but where are the people? So Russian patriotic writers and historians saw the country's resistance to the European army led by Napoleon as a great triumph of the people, a fervent defense of the fatherland inspired by an aroused nationalism. The war indeed is known in Russian as the Отечественная война, the first of two, hopefully no more, the Fatherland War. Yet at the moment of the French invasion, Alexander I issued the following rescript that concluded, quote, I will not lay down my arms while the last enemy soldier remains in my empire, unquote. No mention is made in his orders and documents of the Russian people. And the empire is presented as the possession of the Russian emperor. Even as the French moved toward Moscow, Alexander's advisors had to convince the reluctant emperor to go to Moscow to take on the role of national leader. His manifestos, written by the conservative poet Admiral Alexander Shishkov, appealed to the people's patriotic and religious feelings, and the Tsar was depicted by writers of the time as the angel of God, as our father, loved by his subject peoples to whom he feels great love, and after the French had retreated from Russia, both the powerful valor of the people entrusted to us by God. But in fact, in most of the Tsar's own proclamations, it's divine providence that's seen as ridding Russia of its enemies. Russian authorities, in other words, resisted portraying the great victory as a popular triumph which would give some strength and legitimacy to the people. But instead, they projected it as a divinely ordained triumph of autocracy supported by a devoted people. The people's involvement in this imperial scenario, writes Richard Wortman, threatened the Tsar's image as a superordinate force whose title came from outside and from above, from divine mandate, or from the emanations of reason. In social terms, it was impossible to present the people as a historical agent in a scenario that glorified the monarch's authority as the idealization of the ruling elite, unquote. For the rulers of Russia, as well as their most faithful followers, there was no distinction made between state and nation, between the loyal people and dedication to the empire. What had already emerged in Europe, particularly in 18th century France, was the idea that the nation as represented in the people, was distinct from the monarch and from his state. And eventually the French nation would destroy that monarch and take over the state. Such a division is not envisioned in the language of that time in Russia. There's no idea of the nation as distinct from the monarch and the state. There's, of course, no claim to sovereign power. That was not something that was possible to think in the reign of Alexander I. That would have been a sinister threat to autocracy. But whatever the monarch's vision of how victory was won, others among the writing classes developed their own ideas of what Russia was and why it had triumphed. And already in 1812, and immediately after, several commentators adopted the new language of nation and attributed the victory to Russian national spirit and the people's patriotic solidarity with Tsar and fatherland. Certainly in the next decades, 1812 came to symbolize a particular sense of a Russian fatherland, a Russian nation. And in this majestic novel, War and Peace, Vayna и Mir, Lev Tolstoy depicted the simple Russian folk as fundamentally patriotic and prepared to die to defend their native land. So we have images, and we have literary tellings, and we have a discourse developing with 1812 as a national, kind of national defense, national uprising. The embryonic national identity and state patriotism, however, I would argue, were largely limited to the upper classes, the imperial court, the nobility, some townspeople, and some intellectuals. Those who Dominic Levin refers to as the Old Russians, like Admiral Shishkov, Count Fyodor Rostopchin, the historian Karamzin, the editor Sergei Glinka, and the Tsar's sister Ekaterina. They were advocates, fierce advocates of Russianness, traditional Russian culture, and national pride. So there was Russophilia, there were kind of nationalistic feelings, etc. But how far down did they go? And how can we tell how far down they went? From the evidence that I've read, such sentiments did not extend widely or deeply into the common people. It seems, from what we have as evidence, that peasants were prepared to defend their own villages against foreign invaders. And they even defended their villages against marauding, looting Russian soldiers. But there was no general enthusiasm among peasants for the war against the French. Advisors to the Tsar recognized the need to mobilize the passions of ordinary people to help in the defense of the country. I quote, "We must try to raise the morale and spirit of Russia's own population and arouse its commitment to a war on whose outcome Russia's very salvation and existence will depend." This is from Barclay de Tolly. The war minister spoke of people defending the holy faith and the frontiers of the fatherland. The emperor himself told a Finnish officer that we have to unite the Russian people against the French, and therefore we have to see Napoleon as the aggressor and to fight the war on Russian soil. So there was great fear at the time, actually, that the Russian peasants might rise up and support Napoleon, who, after all, had just abolished serfdom in the Duchy of Warsaw. This Russian army was largely made up of conscripted peasants who generally were forced to leave home and their families and serve for 25 years. There were no peasant volunteers, not even into the militias ordered by the Tsar. Peasant soldiers were often treated brutally and with sneering condescension from many of their noble officers. The same social distinctions and divisions that separated the upper and lower classes in Russian society were also reproduced in the ranks of the army. And yet, Russian soldiers did fight and die by the tens of thousands, and one has to still try to figure out, with very little evidence, what their loyalties were. They varied from loyalty to their fellow soldiers, often very important in armies, with whom they had long served, to fatalism, bred by their training and socialization, to an elementary sense of self-preservation. When one can conclude the following: there may have been no upsurge of great peasant patriotism in 1812, no nationalistic movement, but neither was there a rising against the emperor and the state by serfs against their masters. So it's a very complex picture that needs to be differentiated. What I tried to do in that last example is show how one might see how important empire, autocracy, and these scenarios of the state are in understanding what's going on in Russia, rather than seeing history inevitably as a move from a decrepit, failing, falling, fatalistically indicted empire to the triumph of the nation. So what we're trying to do is develop a new kind of master narrative of Russian history, one that doesn't depend on this fatalism, on defeat, on collapse, but rather tries to look at Russian history in its own terms. Спасибо за внимание.
Well, that's time for questions, and we'll take one by one, and then we'll see how that works. Eduard?
Yes, thank you. Putin would definitely like it, so I'll apply for a mega grant.
We tried.
Again, I don't see a big contradiction between these two facts that you described.
Can you just stand up?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't see a large contradiction in these two facts that you described at the end of your lecture. That the peasants didn't have a particular loyalty to the Tsar on the one hand, but neither they rebelled against the Tsar. I think it falls into the picture where they lived a local life. And basically, in Eugen Weber's terms, they
were not Frenchmen yet.
They were not Russian yet. Yeah, the peasants had not become Russian yet. So, and the process had not finished even by the World War I, as Denikin writes about soldiers from Central Province who didn't want to fight Germans because they were from Central Province. Germans would never reach there. So that didn't change.
Yeah.
So it is a question of modernization, in other words.
Right. I agree completely with what you said, and there's been a trend in Russian history lately. A very easy argument is that Russia, at least in the imperial period, never really achieved nationhood, never became a nation. But that doesn't really tell us that much, right? So it's a good corrective to the general trajectory that empires must turn into nations, or they must fail, and then the nation will emerge. Which, of course, is precisely the narrative about the Soviet Union, which I've also argued against, but we can talk about that in a moment. And I think you're perfectly right that even on the eve of World War I, there were other kinds of loyalties and other kinds of identities competing with any notion of a Russian nation. Some people had it. For instance, and there were some institutions like the Ministry of War, which was trying to inculcate a sense of nation because it was a good, cheap, effective way to get people to fight and die. Right? But there were also people who, if you asked them, are you Russian? Вы русский? They would answer, я православный, или я здешний. I'm from here. I come from this place. Because there wasn't yet this sense. Now, they knew they were in Russia. They knew there's a czar. But how we get to those complexities and how we're going to call this, instead of jumping immediately to an idea of nation, is still a problem to be investigated. Yeah. Okay.
Father Lisowski, I teach sociology at this place. Actually, it's interesting for me if your model can fit to some other cases, like Nazi Germany Empire. That was definitely an empire because they expanded. They have an elite. Elite was of different kind because it was pretty permeable.
Yeah.
So people from all socialist states could join them. And in fact, Napoleonic France, another empire. What makes it different, once again, from your definition, elite was pretty permeable. Murat used to be, as you, I guess, some other people, they also recruited from pretty low strata, social strata. And to my mind also, it's not a question, comparisons with late 18th century are not particularly legitimate because, having the kind of army which we had at that time, you refer only to Napoleonic War, you refer only to 1812 war. But before that, Russian troops under leadership of Suvorov fought in Italy, fought pretty successful, and nobody tried, to instill any kind of elevated patriotism. They just had a general whom they trusted.
Yeah.
The same case in France with Napoleon. So there are different ways to mobilize imperial themes.
Yeah.
To my mind, it was important for empire and expansion. What kind of elite? Is it permeable or not?
That's already the third question. So let's limit one per. Try to formulate one question per. It's your choosing of.
Those are very good remarks. Very good. No, I would not make the argument that an empire requires an impermeable elite. I think you're perfectly right in mentioning that. It varies in different places, right? So, because nowhere in Europe do we have a caste system. Do we have people absolutely determined by birth? Even under Peter the Great, Menshikov came from nowhere.
Yes.
And the Empress, I won't tell you where the Empress Catherine I came from. But there were possibilities of moving through the ranks. But an estate system is certainly different from what you find in the 20th century in a capitalist society with when classes and social mobility is greater, as you have in the Nazi Empire. So I would never make that argument that it's impermeable. But distinction has to be maintained in order for you to have an empire, and that distinction is about superiority and inferiority. So that's the model, I think, applies across the board in that way. But I don't make the argument that the Russian Empire was a Russian empire, Russkaya. It's not an ethnically Russian empire. And nor was the Soviet Empire a Russian empire. It was Soviet, it was communist, whatever. and the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, was about an elite ruling over all of its people, including Russians. And that differentiation was important.
How about the Nazi Germany? How imperial was the Third Reich? What was imperial about the Third Reich? I think that because many of the questions kind of reverberate about the distinct path of imperialism in the 20th century. And this is, a comparable, this is what the T model usually puts together with the Soviet Union, arguing that these were the same.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on that? I mean, have you is it important as a comparative
No,
case?
I think it's very important because you want to deal with cases, and you definitely showed two of the cases which are problematic, that is Napoleon and Nazi Germany. Why are they problematic? Because they don't fit neatly into the categories, right? Because, in fact, there is a kind of intermediate category, which we're also working with, which we're calling imperial nation. There are nations, and Russia might be one of those today, that in its very understanding of nationhood involves an imperial discourse as well, right? So that the idea of Velikaya Держава, if you think of Russia as Velikaya Держава, you're implying something about the imperial as well, and particularly about expansion or influence abroad, etc., etc. So the Nazi regime is a nation state, an imperial nation state in a way. And much of its rhetoric is definitely nationalist, racist, chauvinistic, but it's also about expansion and Lebensraum, etc. So it's a kind of hybrid form of an imperial nation state. And that might fit Napoleon as well. That might fit the Napoleonic Empire. But I'd have to look more closely at that. And that's something that's a good point to look into that. Yeah.
And Victor Taki was next. Yep.
I wonder how would you locate Stalin's period on this trajectory of the evolution of the Russian nation? In particular, what would be your attitude to the thesis of Veiko Vujicic, who actually claims that Stalin is the creator of the Russian nation, because it's precisely during his rule that, let's say, almost the majority of the population started to live in the cities, and this association between nationhood and village was somehow kind of weakened, and at the same time the association between Russian nationhood and industry, so to say, was forged. And, well, a thesis which is otherwise supported, I think, by Catherine Merridale in a book which is called Ivan's War, where she says that basically the Second World War was the last war fought by the Russian peasants, but they emerged out of this war, no longer peasants, but rather kind of members of some sort of Soviet or Russian community.
Mm-hmm. Very good question, very good question. Actually, I have a paper on that, kind of, so, which I won't give you right now. Okay. We don't have time for that. Okay. And this is a very good audience. They're very patient and so forth. But I'm going to introduce a concept here. And if you noticed, in the way we were talking about empire and Russian history and this notion of reciprocity, that states have to do something for their people so that people have reasons to obey even despotic or autocratic states, and we know that Stalin was extraordinarily popular, the whole story of his funeral, etc. Something's going on. People are being murdered by the hundreds of thousands. 700,000 are killed in 1937-38. At the same time, people are enthusiastically building socialism and love Stalin and are ready to go, za Rodinu, za Stalina, So something very complex is going on, very interestingly. And the concept of reciprocity is based on a notion of affective disposition or emotional ties. And what a government would ideally like to do is link its people emotionally with the state and with perhaps the leader of the state. Now think of what the Soviets did in their project early on. And by the way, I'm probably the least anti-Soviet, the least anti-communist historian in the West. So I'm an anti-communist, right? Like Moshe Levine, anti-communist. And I won't go into that, but that's another question. But these Bolsheviks came to power in this country, and now they need to build a state and build loyalty for a new project. And what did they do? They gave up nationalism, Right? Nationalism, bad. Bourgeoisie, nationalism. They gave up religion, the church. They gave up all the things that might have been able to link them to people, right? Lots of them are not even Russian. They're Jewish, they're Georgian, they're Armenian, and so forth. All good people, by the way. But, you know, that's different. But so they have to do something. How are they going to create this project? And there are a number of ways. They're on the side of history. They are going to bring social welfare to people. Eventually, they begin to cultivize Lenin. They make a cult of Lenin, which eventually develops into the cult of Stalin, which Jan Plumper has written brilliantly about in a recent book, etc. And to answer your question more directly, unlike the 1920s, the 1930s are a moment at which there is a huge effort to link people in some kind of emotional relationship to the state, which culminates in the war. So there is a kind of coherence, but it's not the making of a Russian nation. It's the making of Sovietsky Narod. Eventually it's called Sovietsky Narod. And it's a very interesting concept. It's a kind of multinational nation of different peoples, with one of them superior, eventually. The Russian nation is superior to these others. And I would argue that World War II is the moment in Soviet history when the idea of Russia and Rodina and Отечество are married together with the Soviet state. So you could imagine before that being Russian and so forth, and Rodina and the Soviets. That becomes extraordinarily difficult from World War II up to about Gorbachev. It starts to fray later in the Brezhnev period. But when I first came to the Soviet Union in the 1960s, people didn't talk about the revolution. There was one movie about the revolution. It was, people would laugh at it. It was all about the war. Ivanovo Detstvo, they were all about the war. The war was absolutely central, as you well know, to what Russia was, what the Soviet Union was. That effort of defeating fascism. I would say that's the moment of what political scientists would call, World War II is the moment of what political science call political integration.
You see, in historical sociology, there is a strong tradition of theorizing empire that began with Shmuel Eisenstadt's study of political systems of empires, and it was continued in the so-called multiple modernities approach in the 1990s, in the works of such authors as Johan Arnason, who considered the Soviet model of modernity and its imperial traits. And if we turn to recent American history, there was an interesting discussion by Michael David Fox. Is he from Michigan, by the way?
No, he's in Washington.
Good friend. So he discussed two camps in American history, the so-called modernists and neo-traditionalists. And he argued that the modernist camp is in fact very close to the multiple modernity approaches in sociology, but the historians who follow it are generally unaware of this fact. So, in your opinion, what are the reasons for some kind of reluctance on the part of historians to use sociological approaches to empire?
Well, until your question, I wasn't convinced or knew that we were reluctant. But now I will read these things. I've read Eisenstadt because it's a fundamental book, and so and some of the others I can ask you about later. Because I don't think we're reluctant. Historians in America very often tend to be quite empirical or factological. In our own department at Michigan, which is one of the more theoretical and comparative departments, we don't, as of right now, have a course in social theory. There's no sociologist, political scientist, or anthropologist at Michigan or any other major university who wouldn't, in their first year as a graduate student, take a course in social theory. But when I offered a course in social theory to my historian graduate students, they were extremely upset. Eventually, they wanted to get a good grade, so they did the reading and all. But that happens. But so we in some ways we're ignorant of some of these kinds of trends and so forth. So I apologize I apologize for that. I want to say a word about your other thing, though. This divide in American or Western historiography between the modernists, those who feature modernity, and the neo-traditionalists. I taught for 11 years at the University of Chicago, and my closest colleague was Sheila Fitzpatrick, who is one of the founders of this so-called neo-traditionalist view. I stand, I think, a little bit between the two schools. I call myself, I take what I call a radical middle position, right in between the two. But I'm very suspicious of some of the writings about modernity that I read. And I've been a little bit critical, including in that article in Ab Imperio, which I never published in English, but I should eventually, and someday I will.
That's published.
Yeah, it's published in Russian, yeah. The modernity school argues that Russian history can be understood as one example of a negative example of high modernity. And modernity takes all of its meaning from the sort of school of the dark side of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was about progress and education and conquering nature and rationality and science and secularism, but it was also about surveillance by the state, enumeration of different populations, social engineering, which could lead to eventually the Gulag and the Holocaust. So, and that's the concept that's being used in Russia, and it was used by people like Michael David Fox or Peter Holquist to link Russian history to Western European history in a new way, right? And not see them as separable. So that was okay. My problem is, if a concept like modernity is so broad that it can both explain the Holocaust and the Gulag on one hand, and social progress and rationality and the conquest of disease and all the positive things also that came out of the Enlightenment, you know, mass education, whatever, it's too much. If something explains so many things, how powerful is it if we don't somehow limit it in its capacities? So I don't find it as exciting, but for a whole generation of younger scholars than I, it was very fruitful, and they loved it. But in the hands of some, and I won't mention their name, well, I will mention their name, like Amir Weiner, he has a book on the gardening state. It is resurrected what I would call a neo-totalitarian school. So now, if you look at people like Jörg Babarovsky in Berlin, or you look at Weiner, or there are many others, again, we're back in the Historikerstreit. We're bringing Nazism and fascism together in a new understanding of totalitarianism. And I think that's a disaster for Russian history.
Gentleman in the back.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Suny, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Alexander. I'm the second year faculty of law student, and I have which casual knowledges in history. My question is pretty simple.
We can help. There is a faculty of history in the High School of Economics. We can help.
That's very nice. It is the fact that Russia is no more an empire. And as the British Empire fall in the middle of the 20th century, we have such a syndrome as the fallen empire syndrome. What can Russians do to overcome that syndrome? And if we need to do that, what can we do?
Well, you know, you asked that question at a moment when to the West, Russia looks like a very imperial power, right? So now,
Putin's money at
yeah, so it's a very difficult and interesting question. It's difficult, and you know, it's very difficult because Russia has a very powerful negative image in much of the West. And it's a very convenient image. And I would say that there are many of us, not as many as there should be, who have been trying to fight against that and try to understand the peculiarities and particularities of Russian behavior, Russian attitude, and so forth. As I said before, you know, they think of Russia as a huge, powerful, expansionist state, when in fact I believe that Russia acts out of weakness often because it doesn't have many cards to play, right? And The United States, on the other hand, which is really a very powerful state, you know, our defense budget is equal to the next 12 or 13 countries in the world combined. It's a superpower without much political culture. But anyway, that is a lot of power in the hands of people who don't really know what to do with it. So the fact that Russia is involved in Crimea, and I think Putin made an error by moving too fast in that area and confirming all of these images, one has to take seriously. If people are thinking of Russia in a certain way, and you act to confirm that, that becomes a material force, as Marx might have said. It becomes a reality. And that's part of the game. That's part of what the way the chessboard is arrayed. So that's not going to help right now. Now, just a few months earlier, Putin had helped Obama by coming to that agreement over chemical weapons in Syria. For about 3 days, maybe 5 hours, Russia had a very positive image in the New York Times or wherever. So then he wrote that editorial and so on. But anyway, look at on the eve of the Crimea events, the eve of the catastrophe that's now happening. There was the Olympics. That was very important for Vladimir Putin personally. A lot of money spent. Maybe there was corruption, blah blah blah. But it was a major event. It was the Olympics. And the United States and the West, particularly the United States, they didn't send representatives. They made a lot of fuss about the bill on gay rights and so on. In other words, already things were bad over this issue, over the Olympics. And then now you have a major crisis. And so all of these discursive forces already are arrayed and people are working. So what can Russia do about it? We have to see how we come out of this crisis, right? I'm not a Russian, and you'll have to forgive me, but my father was born in Tbilisi, so I'm almost a neighbor. In my view, it is not in Putin's interest or Russia's interest to take Crimea. What would really be in Putin's interest is for Crimea to be autonomous, to guarantee the basis for the Russian Navy, which is absolutely important, right? To give rights to the Tatars and the Russians for their language, etc. To have a broad government in Kiev, but to keep Crimea as an autonomous republic in Ukraine. And then Putin would have 1 million Russian votes in any Ukrainian election, right? Which, if Crimea becomes independent or part of Russia, Ukraine is Ukrainian, and will move to the West, and you'll have NATO there. And that's what seems to be happening. So this is a very delicate moment for Russia. By the way, I understand, and I've been saying this in public in the West, in Germany and in America, Russia, it's not, I mean, the West has been very aggressive in its policies in Ukraine because they would like it to be in the Western orbit. That would be a tremendous victory for the West, and Russia would be then totally isolated. So this is a very delicate and difficult moment. I understand why they did what they did, but I think he acted a little bit out of panic and out of fear and so forth, rather than thinking solidly about the other ways that he might have moved. So we have to wait to answer your question. Sorry.
Thank you very much. My question is still very professional, but not political either. It's actually about the beginning of your lecture. When you spoke about Western perception of Russia, and I just wonder, is it really, really specific, something specific about Russia? Because apparently, what you just told, that there is no, say, I forgot in Russian. It's a rule of law, that kind of things that you kind of expect but don't find in Russia, right? I guess there are many other places in the world, right, where you don't find them. So what you just told about Russia, is it specific or it just how to say, particular instance or more general?
Yeah.
And possible explanation, so my question is it right explanation or not would be just saying Russia kind of borderline case, right? So you still can apply kind of categories, right? But they don't work. And in other cases, like China, maybe you're just not trying. So that would be an explanation, or there is something else going on.
First of all, these discourses, this rhetoric about Russia goes way back. I have another paper, by the way, in which I trace some of these things. You go back to the 15th, 16th century. The first travelers, Olinarios or whoever, came and they talk about these are people who love slavery. They need despotism to organize themselves. And you can find this rhetoric going right in through the 19th century, George Kennan or whatever, all the way up into the Soviet period. And then again, when you have the Soviet period, you have a revolution, you have Lenin, you have Stalin. It confirms all of these things, right? Which also constrains what the Soviet Union or Russia can do, given the way people think about them, right? So these are very old and powerful images, which one tries to argue against and show. And by the way, none of these images. You have images of the United States. But I came yesterday to Saint Petersburg, and I turned on the TV and I'm watching RT or I'm watching Russia 1, and I thought, I'm in another world. This is like the whole world turned upside down from Berlin. So what was black over there is white. What's white over here is black. And now they're fascists in Kiev. And who's behind it all? Who's behind it all? The United States. No, ребята, что это такое? Believe me, Obama doesn't want this problem. He doesn't need this problem. He can hardly govern in that crazy country. I mean, really. And he doesn't need this. He has other big problems, But suddenly this lands on his table. And I don't think he's doing very well, because he's courting this Kievan government, instead of saying, no, you've got to broaden this government, it has to be more representative, we need to, and they're saying that Lavrov has to speak to them, or Putin has to speak to them, when they're our guys. But it's not manipulated and marionetted from Washington and all, And who do they have on TV now? It's like 1991. Dugin, Zhirinovsky. I mean, you don't have better people to bring out.
There's a question up there. Yes, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for an interesting and enlightening presentation. And second of all, I would like to apologize for a social science kind of question. I would like to bring you back to the research question, which was, namely, how has the state stayed together? And you bring some interesting and convincing arguments that contradict the predominant narrative that sees a teleological path towards the nation state and imperium. But I didn't really hear anything about the alternative that you and your colleagues suggest regarding this question. Well, what are the hypotheses for answering the research question?
That's a very good question. Yeah, thank you. This is the beginning of a book. I'm not apologizing, but it's the beginning of a book, so it doesn't quite work itself out. But one of the things we're arguing that, look, states stay together, of course, fundamentally underneath all is force of some kind. Violence, right? That's the way they're made. Or as Charles Tilly said so brilliantly, states make war, and wars make states. So that's fundamental. And then we want to go on beyond that to find out how they create authority and legitimacy. And our contribution there is that you need discursive power along with coercive power. And within that, we're arguing there's this notion of reciprocity that has been largely overlooked, particularly at certain points in Russian history. The way in which the state is not simply despotic and tyrannical, but also provides some goods and services to the people that makes them then willing to obey the regime, right? And we want to show how that is carried through even in periods like Stalin's period, and even today in Putin's Russia. So that, I think, is our contribution to how the country remains cohesive in the absence of a kind of coherent idea of nation. So in a place like France, or even the United States, there are relatively coherent and consistent ideas of nation. And in Russia, that's less prevalent and less visible, except perhaps, I mean, it's now more visible, obviously, in today, but still, so there must be other things at work. If it's not a kind of national coherence in terms of a single nationalist understanding and identity, what else is going on? And so we're trying to work out with this. Does that answer your question? That's what we're trying to do. We'll see. It's still a book being written. Yeah.
What I suggest at this moment is that we take a round of 2 to 3 questions, and then a final question. I mentally raised my hand. You haven't noticed, but I did at the end. So I see 3 hands. So I think Victor was the first. Victor. One question. One question. One question.
Полтора.
По поводу эмоциональной связи с государством и взаимной, не являются ли эти характеристики общим принципом государственной идеологии? Не обязательно идеологии современной постмодерн империи. У Платона мы уже находим идею благородной лжи, как он это называет, когда философы должны рассказывать, воспитатели должны рассказывать детям знаменитый миф о родине матери, о том, что мы все рождены единой землей, поэтому они должны любить ее как мать и друг друга, все граждане полиса должны любить друг друга как братья и сестры. Не является, собственно, это эмоциональная привязанность к государству составляющей любой национальной идеологии. Другое дело, что тип эмоциональной связи может быть разным для разных типов государств, для разных. Но сама эмоциональная связь с государством не является обязательной частью любой государственной идеологии. Есть ли один вопрос? Второй был.
Thank you very much for your very interesting and encouraging presentation. And my question deals with the problem of First World War. To what extent your new approach can bring new light on this founding event of 20th century of violence, genocide, and so on? Your vision of First World War, maybe new approach.
Okay, and the third question from the student. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question about the distinguishing between empire state and nation state. Is there any chance to be an empire state without a nation or sub-nation?
Okay. Okay. So I think, Victor, that I agree with you that that any successful state will try, if I understood your question right, will try to develop some kind of emotional ties, reciprocal ties, or emotional ties with its population. It can be done in a variety of ways. I mean, so one of them could be reciprocity. And there has to be some, at least people have to feel they're getting something from the state in order to acquiesce or go along or be mobilized. But it could also be that the emotional tie would be hatred of an enemy and war against an outsider, the threat of terrorism. I mean, there are a number of other ways that you could play those emotional cards rather than just reciprocity. So, but I am more and more affected by, and I'm more and more convinced that if we want to understand history and want to understand politics, we must take seriously emotions. That a lot of politics is about emotion, particularly certain political emotions like fear, anger, hatred, and resentment. And this leads me to the question about World War I, because I'm working now on a book on the Armenian genocide. And I'm trying to understand why the Turks carried out the mass deportation and murder of something like 1 million of their own subjects, right? That's a big question. And I'm using a concept of affective disposition to understand how they came to understand that these Armenians were an existential threat to their empire. And it was about resenting their successes within the empire, fear of them being connected to the Russians who were coming across the border, hatred of who they were as people, and so I'm working on those kinds of things. So emotions are very important that way. And I would love, if I had more time and a longer life, to work on the affective disposition, let's say, of Russians on the eve of World War I, which I don't think there was a great, there was a moment, just as the war was declared, the people were very enthusiastic about the war. But who? Certain urban peoples, etc. There was actually a very strong movement in much of Europe against the war, which we play down. Jean Jaurès was assassinated for speaking against. There were mass marches in Berlin by Social Democrats. And the whole Social Democratic Party, Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, except for a very few like Plekhanov and a few others, was against the war. So there were various things going on. And of course, the Tsarist government had to mobilize emotions to get people to fight, because they actually fielded an army of something like 5 million people or something, right? The last question about nation and empire. This is something I'm still trying to work with. That is, I've created, or we have created, 2 ideal types. So empire over here, let's say, which is about differentiation, inequality, subordination of one over the other. And nation, which is about homogeneity, people being more or less the same, equal, horizontal equivalency of citizenship. And then in between, a variety of different variations on these themes, like imperial nation or whatever. And one which I think we have to develop more, which may best characterize Russia today, which is a multinational state. So a multinational state would take from empire difference. So peoples are different. They no longer have it on their passports, but Armenians are different from these people, and Russians and so forth and so on. So you'd recognize difference, like Canada does or India does, but you really say it's not about superiority or inferiority. In a multinational state, it's about equality under the law and rights, etc. But supporting perhaps differences, state subsidies to Armenian churches or to Armenian or Ukrainian cultural institutions like Canada has or India. So there's other forms as well. I hope that answers your question.
So I mentally raised my hand, and actually two questions.
He's allowed to.
One is for the benefit of all. One is not personal, but you're speaking in a series of the seminars. We had Jeremy Smith, who also talked about the evolution of the category of nationality and nationalism in the Soviet Union. And you wrote definitively on explaining the collapse of the Soviet Union in the revenge of the past by bringing the dialectics of the empire, by explaining how First Nation is imagined as perhaps a very artificial thing, and then it hardens and becomes the space of belonging and the category that makes sense in politics and in society. And then how the withering away of the imperial center brought these local Republican elites into fear that they need to take into their hands the politics. And that provided an entirely new dynamics to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, crucially, you did not compare the collapse of the Soviet Union with the collapse of Yugoslavia. And in my view, what we're witnessing right now with the current crisis, and this is, I'm not asking you a political question, but really this historical expertise is crucial in explaining current day-to-day politics. Because I think where we are heading now is a Yugoslav scenario. Everybody talked that the Yugoslav scenario in the collapse of the Soviet Union would be Russian RSFSR, Russia taking on Ukraine, both of them are nuclear powers at that moment, right? So this is exactly right, and you can see, you can kind of stretch this analogy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosevska Krajina, right? So they would have skirmishes, and then it will result in a confrontation where Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, would not relinquish the empire, would not think that there will be a redistribution of the space along the default lines of the Soviet nationality policy. So is this comparison important? What are your thoughts on why the Soviet Union collapsed not like Yugoslav federal state? And do you think we are now kind of nearing the chances to replicate the Yugoslav scenario in a very different situation? And the one for public benefit. Nobody asks a historian to predict future. I found a way how to ask this question. How do you think the year of 1917 will be celebrated in Russia in 2017?
Okay. So, first, I think that was like 5 questions, don't you? He's the dean. Okay, so, first, a word about, so I wrote this book called The Revenge of the Past, The Collapse of the Soviet Union. And my argument, so the general view was that nationalism is natural, given it's going to make itself felt. Empires are decrepit, they don't survive. The nations all finally found freedom, they got the kiss of freedom, and they burst out and they all became independent states. And that is the general view of many people, maybe not historians, but certainly in the West. My own view was that, first of all, you have to understand these nations were made in an empire, that empires helped make nations. The Soviet Empire, the Leninist nationality policy made nations where they didn't exist, as places like Azerbaijan, much of Central Asia, or made new, more coherent nations, as in Armenia and Georgia, which were much more multinational. In 1900, Yerevan was a city that had the majority of Muslims. 1900, right? I said that in Yerevan, and I had to be literally carried out by security men. But it's actually true. So, but they made these countries more coherent, more homogeneous. So these nations were made within the Soviet Union. Of course, Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, which had never existed. So my argument was that it wasn't that nationalism led to the end of the Soviet Union, but rather that the Soviet Union, in its efforts to reform itself by Gorbachev, committed suicide. It so weakened the sinews and the backbone of the country, which was the Communist Party and its own ideology, and that he lost control. And to his credit, I mean, Gorbachev is both a great hero and a terrible villain. He's no late Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln used violence and force to keep the country together, even though the South wanted to be an independent nation, right? He said no. But Gorbachev didn't use enough violence and force, and eventually the thing fell apart. And that's the nice side of him, but it led to the collapse of his own country, which I don't think he, of course, wanted to happen. So it's a complicated, different kind of thing. And it was certainly, in my view, survivable. It could have survived under the right leadership had they done things in a different way. And again, in the West, the Soviet collapse is inevitable. It had to happen. It's the natural history. The second part of your first question was part 1A, part B, 1AB, was about hardening. We all love to say, we constructivists, we people who are doing this nationalist history, nations are imagined communities. They're based on invented traditions. They're constructed from whatever ethnic material or whatever you have. Good, okay, imagined, constructed, invented. Once you invent them, once you imagine them, they are real. And people fight and die for these real things, right? We're watching right now the creation of a new kind of Ukraine. Maybe a more coherent Ukraine. It might be a Ukraine that's coherent because it's going to be so anti-Russian. Or because it loses Crimea. So something is happening. Real history is happening. New ways of imagining things about a country is happening. And that's what happened within the Soviet Union, and is happening indeed in Russia today. The collapse of Yugoslavia, you're saying that Yeltsin gave up the empire. And what was his name?
Milosevic.
Milosevic decided, no, we're going to fight for it, and it led to blood. And, you know, as I said, the Soviet Union did not have to collapse. 3 guys who were very drunk got together in Belarusia, and they dissolved it illegally and so forth, you know, and against their own parliament and all the rest of it. So we know that story. But what he did was, to Yeltsin's credit, what he did, and I was opposed to that, of course, because I wanted the Soviet Union to survive because it's good for Armenia. What he did was he prevented bloodletting. There might have been much more difficulty had there been war. Of course, after that, it collapsed. 30,000 people died in Karabakh. In Georgia, I don't know how many, 50,000 in Tajikistan. So it wasn't bloodless. The end of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe, as more famous people than I have mentioned. Then the final thing, will end here, and you can go home and have your dinner and all. And Sasha will feed me, I hope. 1917, how will it be celebrated in 2017? That's a good question, because in fact, the way Russia celebrates it, particularly if there's official celebration, will be the way you define your history and how you deal with the Soviet past, right? You can't get rid of the Soviet past. The Soviet Union and its history, for better or for worse, made the 15 republics that exist today. They are Soviet creations, all of them, including Russia. And one has to come to terms with that. I'm living in Berlin.